Great. Hello, my name is Lucas Belury. I'm a doctoral candidate in the School of Geography at the University of Arizona. And I'm also a visiting fellow at the Center for Community Resilience Research, Innovation, and Advocacy at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And today I'll be talking about flood adaptation in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, specifically focusing on two core themes, which is vulnerability and survival within the context of flooding in South Texas and informal communities in South Texas. So let me just start by situating sort of where I'm talking about the sort of part of the world I'm discussing. So the Rio Grande Valley is a four-county region at the very southern tip of the Texas-Mexico border. And within the Rio Grande Valley, there are thousands of what we call colonias. Colonias are informal, predominantly Mexican and Mexican American, and low-income communities that dot the landscape. You can see on the map on the left is the Rio Grande Valley, that four-county region, and there are thousands of colonias throughout the region, with most colonias in Hidalgo County, which is that sort of middle county. And in addition to sort of being predominantly Mexican and Mexican American, having high rates of poverty, and being largely informal, they also experience really high amounts of flood exposure, flood vulnerability. This is due to a variety of issues that I'll talk about today. One of them is the heavy seasonal rains that the region experiences. There's a sort of a monsoon-like season in the late summer and early fall. There's also really inadequate infrastructure in colonia communities. This includes housing infrastructure, road infrastructure, light infrastructure, but also drainage. There just simply isn't enough drainage in these communities. And this is what colonias often look like. So I think when a lot of folks think about informal housing, you may think about the favelas of Brazil, or really high density urban contexts in which homes are very tightly stacked, for example, on a hillside. What we actually see in the Rio Grande Valley, in the colonias, there are colonias throughout the U.S.-Mexico border region in all four border states. Texas has most of the colonias, but there are colonias throughout the region. But we're actually often talking about rural informality. We're talking about peri-urban regions that actually are well outside or just outside of cities. So these are by definition unincorporated communities. And this is often what they look like. So we're seeing, mobile homes, RVs, trailers that have often been purchased for relatively low amounts of money. So these are actually quite affordable places to live, which is why people choose to live there. And I think one thing we often see in colonias is this sort of little by little incremental building and change over time. You can really see it in the sort of the top right. You see someone has an RV right here, and someone's actually built a structure off of that RV. They're building their home little by little as resources and financing become available. And flooding, as I said earlier, is a huge issue in the colonias. This is actually a flood from 2019 that happened in a colonia in Hidalgo County. And I think this picture says, of course, pictures say 1,000 words. This picture says a lot. So I think what we see is these sort of mobile home and these sort of manufactured housing type communities. You can see how rural it is, that this community is really in quite a rural area surrounded by farmland. In fact, most colonias are converted farms or former farmland that's been converted informally into housing. You can see how widespread out it is. You can also sort of see the sort of irregular nature of housing. They're not sort of perfectly lined up, but they're sort of they're spread out. The housing is spread out throughout. You can tell that a lot of folks' cars were flooded. Flooded cars are a really serious issue in addition to sort of flooded homes. And you can also see, I think, that the kind of flood that we're talking about isn't going to be these sort of massive Katrina level, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey level floods that completely decimate a community. We're talking about flooding that is relatively low level. It stays around for days, sometimes weeks at a time. And it actually is a huge issue in terms of trapping people in their home. This truck you can see has managed to get out of the colonia. It's quite a large truck, but many folks, I'm sure, back here are trapped. And many folks told me during focus groups and interviews that being trapped in the colonia is a really huge issue. I think it's also really important to note that this is all happening at the sort of the context of through a history of, I think, of racism and colonialism. So the Rio Grande Valley is the traditional homeland of what the Spanish called the Cualtican people, although that's not what they called themselves. And in addition, um, this region was also home to the Lipan Apache, the Comanche, and over 200 other tribes, bands, and clans. And this legacy of colonialism and imperialism extended way beyond the Spanish. So the Spanish began colonizing this region in the 1740s under a very violent and brutal system. And that continued into sort of Mexican rule. So under Mexican rule of this region, which the Mexican nation state sort of controlled this region into well into the sort of the 19th century, they established a really strict racial hierarchy in which indigenous and Afro-descendant people were at the bottom of that hierarchy and people of European descent were at the top. Beginning in 1836 with the independence of Texas and later the Mexican-American War, which concluded in 1848, the region effectively switched from a Spanish and Mexican system to a US-based racial system in which rather than having a racial caste system in which blackness and indigeneity were at the bottom and whiteness was at the top, what we now see is a bifurcated racial system in which there's whiteness and people of color. And Mexicans in this era, who maybe formerly were considered full citizens with full rights, had wealth and power, were suddenly stripped of rights, land, and life, often through quite violent means, including lynching by the Texas Rangers. And so just as an example of this sort of continued sort of political tension, this is a quote from a Colonia resident who says, "It has been lie after lie." In Spanish, that translates to mentiras tras mentiras. The county gave permission for construction of the colonia and said it wasn't in a floodplain, but it was. The same thing happened with paying taxes and not receiving services. The county gave the developer permission to build, but they didn't say the area would flood. We are working with our county to improve the drainage in the colonia, but nothing has changed. And I think this really sort of goes to show that flooding in the context of the US is a politicized natural disaster, right? We often talk about natural disasters, but they're not equal opportunity disasters. Certain communities, certain kinds of people are more affected by flooding. Floods are deadlier for communities of color in the US. Communities that are redlined, and redlining is the process of intentional segregation that went on for much of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. We still see the echoes of the legacy today. These redlined communities are more exposed to floods. FEMA flood maps underpredict flooding in communities of color, and flood recovery in the US is more accessible to wealthy and white populations. This has been identified by other researchers, and I have a paper forthcoming that's talking about this exact thing, that flood recovery really is very inequitable along racial and class lines. Another sort of example of this politicized disaster is the fact that FEMA often does not help in post-disaster contexts in the Rio Grande Valley. So this person simply said, FEMA will only help us if we've lost everything, not if our home is damaged. For example, my floor was damaged, but FEMA said that our floor still worked, so they didn't help us. Again, my point earlier is that the kinds of flooding that people are seeing are these relatively low-level flood disasters that aren't completely sweeping away their home, but they're causing a lot of really significant damage, especially in the context of warped floorboards, right? These manufactured or mobile homes are often have exposed crawl spaces, or they have crawl spaces underneath their homes. And when the floorboards get warped, those crawl spaces become exposed. And so there's a huge issue with vermin and pests. A lot of folks talked about mold being a serious issue, and almost everyone I talked to talked about the respiratory issues that they face after a flood. But I also want to pivot a little bit because I think we've been talking about all of this violence and this history, but I think it's also really important to center that colonia residents are very actively engaged in their own lives, that they are not passive victims, but they've actually worked really hard to try to mitigate their flood vulnerability. So this person said, there's always flooding in my home, but I've been putting rocks and sand underneath the house in order to fix the issue. The rocks and sand work when the floods aren't as big, but when there's a lot of rain, it doesn't work. What this person is talking about is something that I've heard over and over in the residents, the colonia residents that I spoke with. Many talk about how they physically lift and elevate their homes in order to reduce their flood vulnerability. In addition to sort of home modification, we also see a lot of solidarity amongst colonial residents. For example, this person said, the first quote, my neighbor gave a ride to my children to go to school and twice took me to the grocery store when we couldn't leave the colonia again. This quote, I think, says a lot. One, it talks about how trapped people are in colonias during these major floods. And two, we talk about this sort of ride sharing network about helping folks take their children to school and going to the grocery store. Again, it's really important to note that colonias are very far flung, often quite rural places. And so a car is a necessity, it's a lifeline. A car is how you get to school, it's how you get to the grocery store, it's how you go to medical appointments. And so if your car has been flooded, and many people talked about their car being flooded, then this is a really serious issue. And so having this sort of neighbor solidarity is really valuable. The next person said, when my home was flooded, all the sewage came up into the house. But also we also couldn't drink the water for weeks after the flood. So a lot of people are on septic and on well water, and when these floods happen, these things merge, and so it makes their water undrinkable. But luckily, my neighbors had bottled water that they shared until we could leave the colonia. Again, the inability to leave the colonia for days or even weeks at a time, and the lack of potable water is a serious health issue. But a lot of folks told me about water sharing network, where they would share water with one another until they could survive. So again, we have really strong sense of solidarity and collaboration amongst colonia residents. However, I do think there's some examples of maladaptation. So a huge issue that I spoke with a lot of people about was this idea of predatory loans. So in the colonias, we call them financieras. These are these predatory lenders. Often they're payday or car title lenders. They have astronomical interest rates, sometimes 400 or 500% interest rate. But because people have very little options, this is sort of their sort of last. They're sort of one of their very few options to sort of finance their post-flood recovery and survival, because as I said previously, FEMA has largely doesn't support their post-disaster aid. So this quote says, "We applied for a loan but didn't get approved for much money, and they asked us for too much in the interest rate. I didn't have another option than to take the small loan with a larger APR. So we had to fix the home part by part, poco a poco, because we didn't get a large loan. We had to get the money together little by little in order to fix the bathroom. Their bathroom had actually fallen through. Their floorboard had been so badly damaged, their floor had been so badly damaged that the tub and the toilet had actually fallen through, so they had to completely redo their bathroom." So just a key takeaways, right? In that we see precarity and marginalization. Plus with recovery in the Rio Grande Valley is actually survival. There is no recovery. Residents are creative and thoughtfully engaged in their own lives. These are not passive victims, but they're very aware of their vulnerability and they actively work to challenge it. But the colonias in the Rio Grande Valley experience a lot of precarity, and this is a result of economic, political, and environmental marginalization. And these forms of marginalization come together, they overlap, and they deepen one another. But I want to turn to sort of one final element of flood vulnerability in the Rio Grande Valley to pivot from my research from the last few years to sort of the research that I'm doing currently. So this person said, "I don't know if I live in a floodplain. But floods are common. I believe the flood zone is changing and that floods are getting worse." So actually, for huge swaths of the Texas-Mexico borderlands, and in Hidalgo County in particular, which has almost 1,000 colonias, there's no digitally available FEMA floodplain data. And lack of data is actually a really critical issue for challenging, or rather for promoting or mitigating flooding in the region. So here's an example I just said of FEMA floodplain data. This is digitally available FEMA floodplain data by county in the Texas-Mexico borderlands. You can tell that 3 out of 4 counties, so Starr, Willacy, and Cameron County, do have digitally available FEMA floodplain data as indicated by these hatch marks. But anywhere you see these dotted marks, which is going to actually be the majority of the border, does not have digitally available FEMA floodplain data, in addition, including Hidalgo, which has more colonias than any other county in Texas. The sort of gold standard for measuring floods is also USGS stream gauges. There are 0 USGS stream gauges in 3 out of the 4 counties of the Rio Grande Valley. In addition, even where there is FEMA floodplain data, this data often undercounts communities of color because FEMA floodplain data only focuses on coastal flooding and river flooding, but not what we see in the colonias, which is flooding caused by high amounts of rain over a short amount of time. These sort of cloud bursts that we see, these sort of flash floods that we see. And so this is a study done that sort of showed where communities of color were sort of being missed by FEMA. And we can sort of see that South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, is a really bright red spot. And this is sort of me now pivoting sort of my more recent work, which is just to say that I think satellites and remote sensing are really powerful tools for mapping floods and trying to sort of mitigate some of those flooding issues. So this is looking at actually a flood in Pakistan, and I think from 2019, if memory serves. But you can sort of just tell. You can sort of look at pre and post flood imagery from space, and we can actually get very high detailed flood maps using satellites. And so again, this is looking at a false color composite. This is a flood from the Rio Grande Valley in 2018. And you can sort of see this is the before imagery and this is the after imagery. And you can sort of tell that this river, for example, has drastically changed and flooded as a result of the flooding. So you can actually see floods from space. I say kind of because sometimes it's kind of ambiguous whether a place is flooded or not. So it takes quite a bit of skill and time. And one way we're trying to mitigate that uncertainty is through precipitory mapping. So in the last year and a half, I've been doing precipitory mapping activities with colonia residents throughout the Rio Grande Valley, specifically in Hidalgo and Cameron County. We've got over 100 precipitory flood maps now. So we're trying to build maps to support local flood mitigation efforts. This is an example of some of the precipitory mapping we've done. This is looking actually at a colonia, an aerial view of a colonia in Cameron County. So we got some of the flooding, but we didn't get all of the flooding. And through this work, through these precipitory maps, we've been building this flood justice tool. And so the flood justice tool isn't quite launched yet, but hopefully it will be launched soon. And we're really focusing on these sort of 4 sort of fundamental community identified needs. We did a series of focus groups with colonia residents and with local community-based organizations to try to understand how might flood data start to be a tool that can be used to improve the situation. And we're calling it flood justice because, as I said earlier, flooding is a political disaster. And here's just sort of an example of some of our flood maps that we've built in the region. This is from a machine learning algorithm we developed in August of 2024, just sort of showing the flood maps that we have and the flood database that we're trying to build. And that's kind of what I'll end with. I just quickly want to thank the folks that have sponsored this research, the Mellon Foundation, the Tinker Foundation, the Google Environmental Justice Fund, the Climate Change Artificial Intelligence Grant, and the NASA Space Grant. All right, thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. This is me, Melassef, speaking from France, where I'm doing my postdoctoral research in Prodit in collaboration with Sidej Khartoum. My focus is on the impact of power relation in shaping the spatial context of Sudanese cities, also the role of traditional knowledge in the adaptation of local community to the climate change. In this presentation, I want to shed light on the experience of a local community in Khartoum, specifically in a small island called Tuti Island during the flood seasons, and how they have used their traditional knowledge to mitigate the flood risks. To answer how traditional knowledge utilized in local contexts for effective flood management, I will give a brief background about the community of Tuti Island as a local community and traditional knowledge bearer, and then I will give a brief background about the system of Attaya as an effective traditional flood management system. So to begin with, Tuti Island was formed at the Blue Nile and the White Line confluence at the core of the Sudanese capital Khartoum, where the two rivers merged into the main line. Sorry. Throughout the years, the island population increased, embracing different ethnic groups. All these didn't change the status of Tuti Island at the rural eye of the capital until more recently, before the war, when the rapid urbanization process came at the expense of its fertile agriculture land. The community have developed over several generations set of resources that are crucial for building community action in response to the flood. So to define Tuti Island as a local context, first of all, the local context refers to the specific social, cultural, economic, and environmental and historical conditions that shape particular a community or region or space. There are many key aspects that shape the local context: the culture, the economic, and the environment, history, and the political system. So culturally, the location of Tuti Island has riches the cultural heritage of which shaped by indigenous knowledge of ancient civilization, Arab and Nubian. The inhabitants maintain strong communal ties with a deep connection to the agriculture and rural life. Family structure and oral tradition play a significant role in presenting their identity. Economically, the local community is primarily based on small-scale agriculture, fishing, and trades, but some decades before the current war, the urbanization and the proximity to Khartoum had led to increased land value and real estate development, providing new economic opportunities, but also posing challenges to traditional livelihoods. Environmentally, the island, as we could see in the previous map, faced by environmental challenges such as the seasonal flood, also the soil erosion, climate change, the urban expansion, and the ecologic changes threaten its sustainability as well. Historically, Tuti Island has been a vital settlement for centuries, which is, with its origin links to the ancient Sudanese civilization. It has served as an agricultural hub and strategic location due to its position between the two Nile. Lastly, politically, the island falls formally under the country, national and legal governmental structure, but it has known for its strong sense of identity and autonomy. So the inhabitants maintain a distinct political identity since the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium period, characterized by self-government, resistance to the external control, and protection of their land rights while presenting their unique heritage. So all of these aspects, all of these key aspects are shaped Tuti Island as a local context, but also shaped the Taya system as a traditional knowledge system. Here is some photos for Tuti Island that could demonstrate the importance of Tuti Island as a rural hub and recreational centers for the inhabitants of Khartoum. So moving to Tuti Island and climate change, as I described earlier, Tuti Island faced by many climate change threats, but in this presentation, I will focus on the adaptation of the island to the risks of increasing flooding. Here are some photos to the floods of 2020, which one of the biggest floods that has been faced by the island has been faced by. To describe the system of mitigation, the system of flood management in Tuti Island, first, I will give a brief definition for the flood management system, which is a set of strategies, technologies, and infrastructure designed to reduce the risk and impact of flooding. But in order to describe a TAIA system, or the traditional knowledge system in Tuti Island, systematically, the research team relied on the framework of the Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, which consists of 4 phases: response, rehabilitation, prevention, and preparedness. The traditional flood management system are the techniques and infrastructure developed over centuries to control and mitigate flood, often use natural and sustainable approach. This system in Tuti Island has been used since the mid of 1940s because the island has been threatened politically by the evacuation of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So they are learned how, or they are forced to mitigate the island themselves, and since then they this system become a fixed mechanism for early warning during the flood season. Systematically, the research team examined TAIA system within 3 main phases: before the flood seasons, the preparedness; then during the flood season, response; after the flood season, the recovery. So the first phase during the flood season, as Tuti prepare for a I'm so sorry. The people of Tuti or Nas Tuti accumulated knowledge about the island terrain through the years, including how the soil behave in areas prone to the floods, the patterns of the Nile flow, and any changes in the ecosystem that occur during the flood seasons. Although this information are available in the government, but the community relies on the inherited local knowledge to identify the location that may at risk, and to determine the time frame needed to mobilize the necessary resources and capacity. They also assessing for the vulnerability due to the knowledge accumulated by the community themselves. They have the ability to recognize area of physical vulnerability based on past experience, periodic observation, and monitoring. The information is public and used to raise awareness amongst the members. This allows the community to prepare evacuation path and center in advance. The second phase is the response. Flood seasons as almost is considered as a festival time, as they work day and night, the women providing food to the entire community who are working near the TAIA. At TAIA, the early watching system is erected during annual flood seasons and named after the spot where they have constructed. Here are the TAIAs during the flood of 2020 throughout around the island. Finally, early recovery. One of the first actions for recovery taken by the Principles Flood Mitigation Community and its sub-community is to conduct a survey of the affected areas. A clear indication that the island is entering the recovery phase is seeing the farmers prepare to the upcoming agriculture seasons. So this is briefly the system of Attaya, but I want to share with you a really useful and interesting website that describes the system, and there are so many photos for the communities during the different phases. They are also GIS maps, song, and so many things. So here is the website. It's the research results of Malmö University. I will send the link to the coordinators of this webinar to be shared with you, and it's really interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you for making me part of this presentation. Please don't hesitate to send me if you have any question related to Sudan context or to the Attaya system. Thank you so much and goodbye.